a neglected nuclear reactor, one that everyone has simply ignored and left as is. One day, an earthquake struck nearby, causing its core to crack and start leaking. The city's residents begin to flee, with some rushing into shelters, while the government desperately tries to both conceal this disaster from the rest of the world and resolve it at the same time. So, will they manage to pull it off? That's exactly what we're going to find out in this video. Let's dive in. The film begins in a South Korean city, where we meet a young man named Oba. Shortly afterward, the son of his late brother comes in to wake him up from his sleep. Oba eventually rouses himself and leaves the room where he'd been sleeping. We then learn that he lives with his mother at the restaurant she runs, and also under the same roof as Uni, who, as it turns out, became a mother figure and was once the wife of Oba's now deceased brother. Currently, Oba is hanging out with his friends. Among them is a very close pal named Gil. We soon discover that Oba, Gil, and the rest of their crew all work at the local nuclear power plant. In fact, almost everyone in the city is employed there. Later on, Oba's fiancée, Yun, arrives and greets him. Soon, Oba and his friends board the bus that takes them to the power plant where they work. Along the way, they are startled by a group of demonstrators who have blocked the road. We learn that these protesters are demanding the shutdown of the nuclear plant, claiming it is extremely harmful to both the environment and their city. Eventually, the demonstration dissipates, and Oba, Gil, and the others manage to reach the plant. There, Gil runs into his father, who teases him for arriving late to work, but Gil pays him no mind and joins Oba and the rest of the crew. After work, Oba meets up with his fiancée Yoon again. He confesses that he no longer wants to work at the nuclear plant and dreams of going to America for a better job. However, Yoon flatly refuses the idea, reminding him that she has no one else but him and that he cannot just abandon her. Oba promises her that he'll think it over and see if he can really make the move. Later, Oba goes home and confides in his mother that he wants to quit his job at the plant and head off to America. His mother, however, completely dismisses the idea, which frustrates Oba, though he keeps quiet and lets the matter drop. Meanwhile, we shift our focus to South Korea's president, a young leader named Kang. We soon learn that President Kang has received a report from the nuclear plant's director, Park. In the report, Park explains that the situation at the plant is perilous, in desperate need of maintenance, and riddled with problems that no one is addressing. Problems that could very well lead to a catastrophe. This information troubles Kang, who is completely in the dark about the matter. He decides then and there that he must meet with the Prime Minister the next day to seek a solution and understand why no reports on the plant have reached him. At the same time, elsewhere, we see Park, the plant director, sitting with an engineer friend as they discuss the crisis. It becomes clear that Park is very worried about the possibility of a nuclear radiation leak. On top of that, he's frustrated because his superiors aren't allowing him to run the plant properly. However, a message soon arrives confirming that his report has reached President Kang, which lifts his spirits and makes him feel that change might be possible. The following day, President Kang meets with the Prime Minister, a man with extensive political experience who seems to wield significant influence over him. Meanwhile, as Park heads to work at the nuclear power plant, he encounters a newly appointed plant manager. This new manager informs President Kang that Park is no longer needed at the plant. The revelation shocks Kang, who becomes visibly dismayed and walks away. As Kang departs, an earthquake suddenly strikes the area, rattling the nuclear power plant and understandably terrifying Park. Rushing back to the plant, Park learns from the new manager that the earthquake has caused a crack in a valve within the nuclear generator, resulting in rising radiation levels and soaring temperatures, with no one sure how to fix the problem. At that moment, Park insists that they must start ventilating the generator immediately to prevent a meltdown. However, the new manager refuses to initiate the ventilation, fully aware that such a move would spark a media frenzy. He opts instead to wait, hoping against hope that the generator will stabilize on its own. Since that's an impossibility, Park finds himself at his wit's end, not knowing what to do. Meanwhile, news of the incident reaches Kang, and the Prime Minister advises him to keep the matter under wraps and not alert the city's residents, so as to avoid the crisis becoming public. But President Kang rejects that suggestion outright, and instead he orders the evacuation of the city. We then see that every resident, including Oba's mother Uni and the child Min, begins to leave for a local shelter. At the same time, Oba, Gil, and all the plant workers remain on site. Suddenly, a massive explosion rocks the facility. The nuclear generator has melted down because the crucial ventilation was never carried out, and with it, the true disaster begins. Next, we return to Oba, Gil, and their fellow workers, who are all heavily affected by the explosion. Nearly everyone is trapped under the rubble. Yet, Oba manages to get up and finds that his friend Gil is relatively unharmed. Then, Gil's father arrives, picks him up, and they head to the hospital. Meanwhile, Yun, Oba's fiancé, arrives, wanting to take Oba and leave. But Oba insists that he must help the people who remain and urges her to return to his mother, Uni, and Min so that she can protect them. Yun agrees, bids him farewell, and departs. Soon after, Oba returns to the plant to rescue those still trapped, but he suddenly becomes exhausted and faints, leading to his immediate transport to the hospital. At the hospital, the situation is dire. Everyone is severely ill from massive radiation exposure. With the hospital unable to cope, the survivors are temporarily moved to the shelter, where Yun, Uni, Oba's mother, Min, and many others have gathered. There, they discover that the military has locked down the shelter, preventing anyone from leaving, in a desperate bid to keep news of the reactor explosion from spreading worldwide. However, it isn't long before the news leaks out, and people begin fleeing the city once more to avoid the radiation. Meanwhile, Min, Oba's mother, Uni, and Yun manage to escape the shelter. They board a bus along with many others, all trying to flee the city. Back at the reactor itself, Park discovers that the new plant manager has ordered the firefighters to cool the reactor using the water available in their trucks instead of using seawater. This decision infuriates Park, who then approaches the manager and demands that they use seawater instead, arguing that it would be much more effective. The manager, however, refuses outright, insisting that seawater would utterly destroy the reactor, leaving no hope of recovery. In a fit of desperation, Park points out that the reactor has already exploded and become nothing but scrap metal, so there's no harm in demolishing it. But the manager remains adamant, sticking to his decision. Left feeling utterly helpless and frustrated, Park steps away from the reactor and sits alone, unsure of his next move. At the same time, President Kang is sitting with his wife, who reminds him that it is his duty, not the Prime Minister's, to manage this crisis and save the people. Fired up by her words, Kang immediately takes action by reappointing Park as the plant manager, giving him the authority to do what's necessary to contain the situation. He then meets with the Prime Minister and all the officials, announcing that he will take charge of the crisis from that moment forward and resolve the problem. And he makes it clear that anyone who disagrees is free to leave or resign. Naturally, everyone is intimidated by his resolve and readily agrees. Next, we see Park ordering the firefighters to use seawater to cool the reactor and reduce the radiation. They implement the plan, and it begins to show some modest success. Not long after, Park manages to enter the heart of the reactor and pinpoint the location of the cracked valve that triggered the crisis. He contacts Kang and explains that while he has identified the problem, he will need a large team, around 25 people, to enter the reactor's core and help fix it. Park warns that anyone who goes in will be exposed to lethal doses of radiation and will inevitably die shortly afterward. Faced with this grim prospect, Kang is deeply upset, but he decides to act. Without delay, he holds a press conference announcing that he needs volunteers to enter the reactor to carry out the repair work. He makes it crystal clear that anyone who takes part will die soon due to the radiation, so volunteering is entirely on a willing basis, with no one being forced into it. Meanwhile, Oba, Gil's father, and other hospital workers, all of whom have already been exposed to radiation, listen to the announcement and agree to join Park's mission. It isn't long before Park arrives at the hospital and begins briefing Oba, Gil, and the rest with instructions. Without wasting any time, he gathers everyone, including Oba, Gil's father, and many others, and they head into the reactor to weld the cracked valve. Initially, their efforts appear successful, and everyone is overjoyed at the prospect that the radiation problem might finally be resolved. Consequently, those who had fled the city in terror, such as Oba's mother, Uni, and even Yoon, begin returning, convinced that the radiation will soon dissipate and there's no longer any reason to escape. But disaster strikes. The crack suddenly begins to widen, undoing all their repairs, and once again, people start fleeing. Determined to end the crisis once and for all, Oba comes up with a daring plan to permanently weld the valve. However, this plan requires them to destroy part of the reactor, and the person who plants the explosives will inevitably die. Resolving to sacrifice himself for the greater good, Oba decides to take on the mission. Before setting off, he goes live on air, and his mother, Yoon, Uni, Min, and everyone watches as he bids a heartfelt farewell to his family. Then, Oba plants the explosives and detonates that section of the reactor. This bold act resolves the cooling issue and stabilizes the generator, thereby finally ending the radiation crisis for the night. Yet, as with many tragedies, not all endings are happy. Oba and several other workers perish, sacrificing themselves for the sake of the city's survivors. In recognition of their tremendous sacrifices, President Kang later appears on television and personally thanks each one of them. And with that, and this bittersweet heroic ending, the film comes to a close. I hope you enjoyed it. Until we meet again in a new film, there's nothing more to say. That's all. Goodbye